Today is October 12th. When I was a kid back in the US, we would celebrate Columbus Day on this day. That's not a popular thing to do anymore. But when I moved to Madrid back in 2004, I found that Columbus Day was alive and well in Spain as Dia de la Hispanidad. There's a big military parade on La Castellana, complete with fighter jet flyovers and representatives from the armed forces in many Latin American countries. It's quite a scene. Here in Catalonia, nobody's celebrating, of course, because they have certain objections to the concept of Spain. A few years ago, I heard that they were even letting government employees work on both October 12th and December 6th for Constitution Day. Whether a lot of funcionarios ever decided to show up at the office because they felt unrepresented by the Spanish holidays is not clear, but they were officially able to work on a voluntary basis. Today, the big news is about Caso Koldo. More about that later. In the meantime, the public TV, Televisión Española, is going to be showing a documentary in which, after more than 20 years of DNA testing and 5 centuries of speculation, they finally reveal whether Columbus was Spanish, Italian, or something else. I'm not holding my breath on that one, and anyway, I don't own a TV. I guess I'll find out via push notification tomorrow, or I'll completely forget about it. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go. Episode 89. This is Caso Koldo and rent control in Barcelona. Shout out today to Bob and Bob. Bob from Florida and Bob from North Carolina. I met both the other day. Bob from Florida had donated a few times to the podcast here. And since he was with his friend, Bob, here in Barcelona for a day, we met up and we went to Cerveceria Catalana, had a great time having some tapas in a classic Catalan restaurant. I appreciate it. If you are going to be in Barcelona and want to say hi, just send me a message. I'm happy to meet up with people who are fans of the podcast. And by the way, if you go to expatmadrid.com/donate, you can be in the elite club of donors to the podcast, expatmadrid.com/donate. I do this for free because I enjoy writing and I enjoy sharing my knowledge of Spain. But as we're going to talk about in a moment, financial incentives matter, and I could be financially incentivized to spend more time on this podcast if you were to donate. So thank you very much, expatmadrid.com/donate. Let's talk about rent control. I'm reading a book called Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. I'm not exactly sure on the pronunciation there. Sowell. It's a book I wish I had read 20 years ago. It makes a lot of things happening in the world much clearer. For example, most people have a vague notion that supply and demand affect price. In my article about the olive oil crisis, for example, it's pretty obvious. A drought in Andalusia reduces supply and prices go up. Some people move to substitute goods. I personally started buying more butter. That's how price affects demand. Less obvious is the fact that price also affects supply, and if price is manipulated by the government, that will have an impact on both supply and demand for goods. In Spain these days, almost every day there's a new article about the housing crisis. And it's interesting that Basic Economics, the book by Thomas Sowell, explains so much of what's going on. A good example is rent control. Here in Catalonia, the government is implementing a complex rent control scheme. And not coincidentally, the supply of flats available to rent dropped immediately. According to a recent article, in fact, the number of leases signed dropped 17% in the second quarter of 2024, because if the government lowers the price, supply will decrease. Sowell explains in various chapters that it's not necessarily that politicians are unable to solve supply and demand problems. It's just that their incentives are different. They need to get reelected, and rent control sounds great to a large segment of the population. By the time the full effects are being felt, they'll be retired or doing something else. In this case, landlords can just take flats off the market or put them on the temporary rental market where price controls don't exist. It's a controversial sounding statement, but Sowell argues it pretty well, that rent control reduces supply and therefore eliminates options for those who most need cheap rentals. On the other hand, if the price goes up, new supply will be created. People see high prices and want to get some of that money. That explains a couple of other stories I've seen recently. One is the chain of unlicensed hostels in Madrid, where people sleep on inflatable mattresses with no amenities at all. Then there's a story from Ibiza about someone who's renting out a tent in a shanty town on Airbnb. Apparently, in Ibiza, a room in a shared flat costs €1,000 a month, and at that price, people are willing to create new supply to meet the high demand. Another thing that affects supply is government subsidies. If the government has a lot of money available for some project, a supply will be created even though nobody wants or needs it. Perhaps you remember the construction boom previous to the Great Recession, 2008 to 2014, when suddenly almost every provincial capital had an international airport, and high-speed train stations were popping up in the middle of vineyards. That's because artificially high prices, more demand, creates supply seemingly out of nowhere. In this case, it was the European Union that had lots of money to spend on infrastructure. Artificial demand is still demand, and so infrastructure was created. Spain now has 11 ghost airports in areas with little need for them, and a network of high-speed trains rivaling the one in Japan, despite about a third of the population. So that's our economics lesson for today. Now let's talk about the revenge of Caso Koldo. Caso Koldo is back. I wrote and spoke about this a few months ago. It was something about members of the Socialist Party earning millions through anonymous shell companies during the pandemic. The details are pretty boring, but some people got very rich off of selling surgical masks, and later there was some investigation. This week, we learned that members of the alleged plot were using secret phones to speak in code about the deals they were making. Nobody is on trial yet, but a couple of people have been arrested, and I can only think of two reasons why you would need a secret phone. One is adultery, and the other is criminality. By the time you've got a group of people together using secret phones to talk about your anonymous shell company, you've left the appearance of innocence long behind. At the center of the scandal is José Luis Ábalos, who was for a time Minister of Transport, and who was allegedly receiving money and or gifts in exchange for influencing the government's decisions. He was pretty close to Pedro Sanchez for a time, and he and his friends may have had some influence on the €435 million bailout received by Air Europa during the pandemic. But he also, for example, had a girlfriend who was in her early 20s and who was living in a luxury flat paid for by one of the supposed members of the plot. The newspaper La Razón goes so far as to suggest that this girl was also receiving up to €1,500 a day to accompany Ábalos on his trips to Dubai. I don't know if that's true. I don't typically read La Razón, but it came up in my Googling research yesterday. Here in Spain, a member of government exchanging money for female companionship isn't really a scandal in itself. If the money comes from shady sources, then it's an issue. In this case, the shady source is businessman Victor de Aldama, who was arrested a few days ago in a seemingly unrelated case involving €182 million in tax fraud. But I don't know, paying €2,700 a month so that someone else's girlfriend can live in a skyscraper Sounds like a totally normal thing guys do for their bros. And making sure she has spending money on vacation in Dubai? We can't all have a government minister's salary, can we? I could be totally wrong here. Maybe people all over Spain are starting shell companies on the off chance they'll receive millions of euros in government funds in totally legitimate ways. In case you aren't aware, a shell company is a corporation that doesn't do any regular business or have any employees, but stays dormant in case someone needs to move large amounts of funds discreetly. In this case, the shell company associated with Koldo Garcia, who gives his name to the whole shady business, is in Zaragoza and apparently only exists as a small office with nobody to answer the door or the phone. I believe the whole scandal started when the dust from the pandemic settled and someone in the government looked around and asked, why exactly did we spend 20 million euros on surgical masks from a company with no previous billing history? Possibly related to all of this, an early 2020 visit to Spain from Delcy Rodriguez, Vice President of Venezuela. Despite EU sanctions preventing Rodriguez from entering Europe, she organized with Ábalos to land her plane at Barajas Airport in Madrid. According to El Mundo, Ábalos got on the plane along with Koldo Garcia. The rest is unclear, but apparently involved an exchange of briefcases. Is this the same story as Prime Minister Sanchez's wife being investigated for corruption? I can't really tell. It at least appears to overlap, in the sense that she also has ties to Air Europa, which was bailed out by her husband's government. And guess what? The Venezuelan government owed more than 100 million euros to Air Europa as well. And Aldama, the guy paying for the luxury rental for the minister's girlfriend, had a contract to try to get that money back from Venezuela. All this might explain why the vice president of Venezuela dropped in just to unload some briefcases. I guess we'll find out. Or we won't. Like I've said many times, these corruption cases tend to be pretty boring. They also take a long time to develop, and we could have 12 new scandals involving other politicians before the judges get around to bringing this to trial. There's a possibility that Caso Koldo will just disappear, and I guess there's also a possibility that they'll implicate Pedro Sanchez in something big before it's over. We will see. To be fair, the previous prime minister was also involved in some corruption. Remember Mariano Rajoy? He lost a vote of no confidence when judges found his party had been passing around envelopes full of undeclared money for years. That was called Caso Gürtel. You can Google it. And although Rajoy himself wasn't convicted of anything, it seems more than probable that he knew all about it. So it's not just the socialists who do shady things from time to time. It's probably all the parties, or at least the more successful ones. Finally, the 2024 presidential election in the US is right around the corner. I'm not the kind of person who sits around thinking that the government is going to solve my problems. Hopefully you aren't either. They could very well cause me some new problems. That seems more likely to me. Anyway, the other day I logged into the website to vote from abroad, looked at the candidates on the ballot, and just couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to vote for either of them. I guess I will eventually vote for someone, eventually meaning before November 5th. But for now, I'm exhausted by the idea of choosing between two people and two parties I don't actually like. Maybe I'll start a shell company while I procrastinate here, or text my bros on my secret phone to see if any of their girlfriend's rent needs paying. That's all I've got for today. I hope you're doing great wherever you are out there in the world. I recently recorded something about social class in Spain. That was an episode or two ago. You might have heard it. I kind of wish I had read Thomas Sowell's book before talking about social class also. He has some interesting things to say. It's a very interesting book, Basic Economics. The title makes it sound like the most boring thing in the universe, but it's not. Anyway, I also think about social class when I find out that random businessmen are just taking 182 million euros from Hacienda, allegedly of course, but what does one even do with that much money? I am not quite sure. There's a lot of stuff going on at the higher ends of Spanish society that is rather mysterious. I'm also not sure if the fact that these corruption scandals are a constant feature of Spanish life is a good thing, like maybe the judges are serious about getting rid of corruption, or if it's just another aspect of partisan squabbles that they do through the courts rather than, fighting everything out in Parliament. Not sure. Maybe the history books will tell us what exactly is going on here in a few decades. Remember to go by expatmadrid.com/donate to make your donation to the cause here. I will definitely declare it on my taxes. I declare it as crowdfunding, which my accountant said was just fine. If you have millions and millions of dollars or euros, presumably you can get an accountant to go along with a lot of really shady things, but my accountant out here keeps me under strict financial discipline, so I'm not doing anything weird at all. So once again, expatmadrid.com/donate. You could go to YouTube and put in Learn Spanish with Daniel. All of my podcasts are on that channel, but I also have a lot of videos for people to learn Spanish. You can learn sort of intermediate level Spanish. I'm not teaching the very, very basic stuff yet, but I might get around to it. Anyway, I've got quite a few videos up there. I will be making more soon. While you're there, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening. Give me a like and a review if you can. I appreciate it. It all helps me to reach more people. And thank you very much for listening. Hasta la próxima. Bye.